So I'd like to briefly present the challenges behind interoperability in the open source domain and what we are doing in the Calypso project in this regard. Well, actually, most interoperability challenges in the open source domain are related to the high diversity of software and actors in this domain. So we have a very distributed and concurrent collaboration, and in general the open source approach is for highly componentized projects that meet very specific needs. So furthermore, certainly it is true that the accessibility of source code makes it easier to assemble software pieces, but this does however not mean that open source software is interoperable per se or by default. And so this is why interoperability is an issue, and especially when we take into account the fact that enterprises today spend about 40% of their IT budget on integration projects, we see that interoperability definitely is an important trust and quality factor for open source software. So this is why in the Calypso project we follow a holistic approach towards interoperability by addressing all three dimensions of interoperability that are also identified by the European interoperability framework, namely technical interoperability, semantic interoperability, and organizational interoperability. So with regard to technical interoperability, we have seen great advancements, great achievements in recent years due to the introduction of service-oriented architectures and the appropriate open web-based standards in this regard. And this is also evident through the great variety of open source middleware and proprietary middleware in the service-oriented architecture domain. However, while working with such middleware platforms and components, we found out that there are still a number of cross-platform interoperability issues, most of them related to the non-compliance to open standards due to custom extensions or different interpretations of standards. In such an environment, certainly interoperability testing becomes a key success factor, and this is why we, in the Calypso project, we have analyzed several testing methodologies and testing standards. We have developed several distributed integration scenarios using different testing tools, resulting in testbed for interoperability testing. And working with such an environment, with such a testbed, it turned out that actually interoperability testing is a quite cost and time-intensive effort. And these resources are not always provided in open source projects and in the open source domain. So what we have done is we have created guidelines, so to say, a very lightweight approach for open source developers on how to perform interoperability testing in an efficient manner. And you are also, of course, invited to have a look at our results on the Calypso webpage. So second, semantic interoperability. This is mostly about the sharing and alignment of information models. And here, as opposed to technical interoperability, global standards, that means global standardized information models, are not always successful because there are always domain-specific, application-specific requirements, organizational requirements that need to be taken into account. So this is why here we concentrate in the Calypso project on the integration of heterogeneous information models. And more specifically, we identified two objectives, namely first, to evaluate and to improve the semantic integration capabilities of open source middleware, and second, to improve the semantic interoperability between open source forges. And well, how to do this? There's a wide variety of new semantic technologies available. We hear about metadata, we hear about ontologies, semantic web services, all these things. This is why we decided to develop very concrete exemplary proof of concepts that show how these technologies can be used and applied in practice to improve interoperability. More specifically, in the domain of middleware, we developed 2 proof of concepts, one in the area of integration of heterogeneous web services. More specifically, we developed a component for extending people engines and an approach for extending people engines, open source people engines with semantic mapping facilities. Then we took care for the problem of heterogeneous security policies applied by different applications. Furthermore, in the area of open source forges, we demonstrated and showed how to use semantic integration approaches to search across different forges, and very interesting also, how to use semantic technologies and semantic mediation facilities and approaches to migrate projects from one forge to another different forge. So these are very concrete exemplary proof of concepts and interoperability, semantic interoperability approaches. And again, you're of course invited to have a look at the website to learn from these results, to make comments, etc. Third, organizational interoperability. So this is mostly about the policies, about strategies, business goals, business processes, and how to establish cross-organizational business processes and how to harmonize policies and business rules, business strategies between companies that would like to collaborate. This is currently still ongoing work, and we are working on this also to develop lightweight guidelines and very clear advice how to use open source tools in order to manage these aspects, how to define cross-organizational business processes, etc. So we think that with our work in these 3 dimensions, technical, semantic, and organizational interoperability, we can make a contribution towards mastering the diversity of software and actors in the open source domain. And as I've already mentioned, you're invited to have a look at our results on the Calypso webpage in the interoperability section. Thank you.